Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. Now, not too long ago, in fact, it might have just been yesterday, actually, somebody complained of the recent dearth of, I'm not sure if that is exactly how you say that word, D-E-A-R-T-H, dearth, whatever, lack, the recent lack of Bondering's uploads, which rather surprised me because I thought you'd all be very glad that I'd stopped, and shut up. But nevertheless, it appears some people actually do at least want to make it seem like they watch these videos, even if they don't. Well, no, actually, no. I've had actual proof that some people do watch these videos, but I think generally. Anyway, let's not get into that. I thought I'd do some videos, and I thought to myself, well, I haven't really got anything, serious that I can talk about, anything, genuinely important. So I thought, what's something relatively easy I could do? And I thought, well, I'll do some more talking about literature. I remembered I got a 45-minute long rant out of War of the Worlds. So I thought, well, let's try and do that again. So what I want to talk to you about is this H.P. Lovecraft, Howard Phillips Lovecraft, the American author. His dates actually are probably in here. Born 1890, died 1937. Yes, yeah, that's correct. He wasn't terribly old when he died. I'm not very good with the mental arithmetic. I think he was only in his 30s or 40s, perhaps. And his work was not recognised a great deal during his own time. It was overlooked, and he died relatively poor and impoverished and unfamous. But I get the sense, even if you haven't heard the name Lovecraft, I think when I was first introduced to Lovecraft, it would have been watching the animated Scooby-Doo on CBBC in my primary school days. I think it's incredible. I don't remember much of that, but I swear he features in one of the episodes. As for the actual plot of that, I don't know, but I do know that particular iteration of Scooby-Doo had the monsters as real monsters. So it's a departure from the traditional Scooby-Doo, where they are, of course, masked evil men with twirly moustaches type thing. But yes, anyway, so Lovecraft is much more famous nowadays, and even if you haven't heard of his name, you will more than likely have heard of his most renowned creation, that being Cthulhu, who is a sort of eldritch being, albeit not a god. He is called a god in fact, in some of his novels, no doubt, and I think possibly the correct terminology is the elder gods. I'll be honest with you, I haven't looked into the mythos of the whole thing. I just read the book. Well, I say the book. In fact, should we get on track, Bond? Come on, can we do this properly? So it's called The Call of Cthulhu and Other Weird Tales. It's a compilation of, I think, is it 12? Yes, there's 12 of them. 12 stories. I mean, they'd all be called novellas. Some of them are much longer than others. The first one, The Rats in the Walls, is scarcely even 24 pages long. The longer ones do go on for, I think, about 150 pages. So, reasonably bite-sized chunks. And I would recommend this particular compilation. I think it's also available in Penguin Classics. This is in... I think it's just called Vintage, to be honest, this particular edition. But yes, it was bought for me by my uncle, Mark Jackson, for Christmas this year. And I've pretty much been reading nothing but that. I finished it last night. I finished off the last 2 stories last night. And I only intended to read one of the stories, but it was so very, very good that I decided I'd displace all my other reading. Because the thing is with reading, once you get something you really like, you can speed through a novel or whatever it is. Not necessarily a novel, but once you get something that you're actually excited to read. Whereas, oh my days, The Prime Minister, right? It's there on the minute. I daren't even get it off the shelf because I was reading that. Oh, honestly, I've never been so deceived by the blurb on a book in all my life. It purported to be a sort of political drama, but in actual fact, it turned into what amounts to, I think, a Victorian novel edition of a sitcom. And if perhaps I had read it as Anthony Trollope had intended it to be read when he published it in series, 10 chapters at a time, 8 instalments, because there's 80 chapters, it's a bloody long book, then perhaps it would have been more tolerable, like an actual sitcom where you sit down and watch an episode. Obviously, this is before the television was invented. But I did it all in one, and by the time you started on it, you just think, well, I have to read it now. I've started on it, I'm 30 chapters in, it's just so, oh, that was an absolute slog. But no, once you get something that you really like with a book, and you can power through it and you get a load of enjoyment out of it. So I generally find that if you start reading a book, you're not feeling that into it, then maybe read the first chapter of another one, see if that hooks you a bit more. Work your way around it. So yes, I was reading. Where is it? I was reading this Victorian People by Asa Briggs. Sorry, but Lovecraft just possessed me a whole lot more. So I powered through that, and that's what I've been reading. Yes, as I say, it was bought for me by my uncle Mark, who was also very fond of Lovecraft, read a lot of him in his youth, I think. And he recommended that I start with The Shadow over Innsmouth, which is the first one he read, so I did that. And that's what got me, rather. It's very, very good, that one. Just forgive me. Hydration is very, very important, you need to drink. But yes, so I thought I'd maybe share some of my thoughts on Lovecraft in this incredibly ranting style. I haven't prepared at all for this. Yes, so he's an American author, is Lovecraft, born in sort of the New England-y type of region, which is in the sort of top left-hand corner. No, top right-hand corner. Yes, top right-hand corner. That is, of course, if one is using a standard map. I.e. Mercator projection. Yes, and a lot of his tales are sort of set in that region. The Shadow over Innsmouth. Innsmouth is a fictional fishing village, and that's set up in that sort of region. But a lot of the tales are around that general region. Although he does manage to write pretty authoritatively on some places that I don't think he ever went. I don't think he went to the Antarctic. I'm not entirely certain on that, but he manages to write about that in. What is it now? At the Mountains of Madness. Yes, he manages to write about the Antarctic there. So it's not all, there's some fairly exotic locations. Yes. But yes, so he's an American author, but I'll be honest, his writing wasn't all that off-putting in style, The Americans are generally known for not being able to speak English. What was it Oscar Wilde said? We are a people divided by a common language. But you see, the thing is, a lot of even English and British authors nowadays have become so Americanized by no fault of their own. I dare say it's just the way that they have been, brought up in a particular literary tradition that nowadays people just don't care about being. Some might say authentically British, some might say not. It's really not that big of a thing anyway. But it does sometimes rankle my nerves when I'm feeling particularly irritated. But yeah, so it's he didn't come across as any more obnoxiously American than even such a what's the word? Archetypically British author as even Boris Johnson. I'd say there were probably even levels of familiarity to what I would call an authentically British style of writing. So don't let that off put you. I don't remember him ever spelling colour wrong, but he may have just not said colour the whole time. I think a few people aren't awfully keen on his style. They don't think he's actually a very good author, that he's a good thinker, he comes up with very good ideas, but he's not a very good author. I wouldn't agree with that. I think he's very, very good, and especially the way he creates tension. He's really, really very good at creating a sense of tension in his books. And it's that's mingled with his incredible talent for creating a sense of dread in the reader, because he has these pretty horrifying principles. I should mention that it is horror. It's specifically it's cosmic horror, but we'll get onto that. It is horror, and so he has the sort of horrible principle, and he leaves it a lot more for the reader to find out on his own, rather than just being told. And he does generally reveal it at the end, which I think is pretty merciful, because it can sometimes be a bit of a bore when the author doesn't tell you all you wanted to know. A bit like the film No Country for Old Men. I haven't read the book on that one. I don't intend to read the book on that one because it's not really my sort of thing. The film, though, you can much easier watch a film that isn't your kind of thing than read a book that isn't your kind of thing. At least I would find that a lot easier. I don't know, there are some particular bibliophiles who might find it much easier to read a book than watch a film. I assume they're in a relative majority of people. Minority. I meant to say minority. I'm getting all my polars mixed up here today. what was I saying? Yes, but in No Country for Old Men, I remember my friend Matty, he said that it basically just doesn't make sense, and that you're at the end and you don't know what the point of all that was. And I would, to an extent, agree with him. I think once you do know the message of the film, though, it's very interesting, and you can watch it again and notice all the yes. So it's very very clever. I would say very clever, very intellectual, and very 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 astute. Well done, director, whomever you were. But for the general, masses, Juvenal did not say that the masses want complex, witty, erudite, and intellectual discussion. They want bread and circuses, and in general, that's what you have to give them if you want your film to be widely recognised. And obviously, there's no problem in making an artistically expressive film, something that really speaks to what you wanted to say. The only trouble is that you can't rely on it being popularly acclaimed. You can't rely on it being recognised for what you perceive to be its true genius, because of course that is all in the eye of the beholder. So there is a trade-off, of course. There's always a trade-off between doing what you want to do and doing what you know people will like, and that is the same for any theatre of work. I've gotten very very off topic here. But yes, so Lovecraft is generally pretty merciful at letting you know what happens, but then that all happens. It can be really disconcerting, actually, because that can all happen within the space of about half a page. And say you've got about 12 pages left of the novel, and you're thinking, "Oh my God, the climax must be coming now. Surely, come on! It's like we're right there, and the flipping. We've got to find out what happens with the aliens now." And he's describing a car journey through some hills. Why are you describing a river to me, Lovecraft? Let me know what happens with the aliens, for pity's sake. And then it all comes in the final page, and you read it again and again. Did I miss something? What? And it all comes to you at once. So I would disagree entirely with people who say that he's not a very good author, because I really like his style. It's very effective. I'm going to drink some more water now. Thank you for your patience. So I really rather like Lovecraft. And he's got, some might say it's very flowery in language, but I rather like that. And another thing that comes across in his writing is he's very clearly a man of several very very academic interests. He's very clearly an intellectual sort of bloke. Even in a story where the main problem is not, dealing with questions of architecture, he's always very, very, and possibly this age with his powers of description, but he's always very turned on when it comes to questions of perhaps architecture, as I hinted at earlier. He's always very interested in what these things might have looked like, and it comes across that he's very erudite in matters of architecture, very erudite in matters of literature, for example, of paintings and things. He always references these other interests, and mathematics as well. He clearly had a bit of a hankering for mathematics, because of he always talks about non-Euclidean geometry and things of that nature. So he's a man of many and diverse interests, one might say, and that comes across in his novels. It's clearly a very intelligent sort of bloke. But yes, so now let me get into the meat of what he was writing about. So it is all fiction, of course. Though he does ground it somewhat in reality. So there's certain events that happened. So there's an earthquake, for example, in one of the stories, which obviously more than likely was not caused by Cthulhu, but he manages to weave it in. So there's always that level of realism which helps. But in general, yes, so as I mentioned before, it's cosmic horror is what he's writing. So it's horror, which means it's meant to scare you, but it's not meant to scare you in the same way of just sort of, there is a scary thing. It's much more insidious than that. It's and I don't mean the film Insidious. That doesn't really go very far in terms of Lovecraft. Yes, so cosmic horror, the idea, it stems from Lovecraft's belief system, his philosophy, which is called cosmicism, though it's unlikely that he was the origin, the genesis of that particular term. He does like to use the word cosmic in his books a lot, but I think cosmicism is probably a later invention. The word itself, even. I'm referring to, obviously, the ideology he would have had fully formed. But it is essentially the idea, it's a kind of counter force to I suppose what you might call anthropocentrism, or as an unyielding belief in science. It is essentially the idea that man is not the most powerful being in the universe, and that we have not got all the answers, and that we cannot control everything, and that there are several things in the universe which are very, very much greater than us, and which we have not even the slightest comprehension of. That's the idea of the cosmic sense of his writings, is the idea of the universe as independent of man, and man as a very insignificant speck in the same universe. And he expresses this most often, in fact, in all the stories I've read here. He might do it in different ways in other writings, but I would suppose not. He does this through his, what might be called the Lovecraftian horrors, or the monstrosities that he constructs. Which I suppose you might also say terrifying in a traditional sense, but then also terrifying on a greater level, with the implied independence of humanity and the implied inexplainability of it. So allow me, if I may, to run you through the basic structure of a Lovecraft story, in that it will be narrated generally in the first person by a sort of bookish intellectual type person, clearly based on Lovecraft's own experience of being a human, who will enter the story as a kind of skeptic. Though, of course, it generally starts with a sentence along the lines of, "I cannot hope to describe the horrors to which I have borne witness in these events, and I have only been compelled to do so by something or other." So it generally starts with something like that, which really sets the tone, scary things about to happen. So that's generally how it starts. But then anyway, he'll get into the narrative, and he'll basically start off with saying, "I was a skeptic. I didn't believe it. There was some old wives' tales, and there was some old Indian legends that have been told of these things going on in the mountains and whatnot. And then there was such and such a thing happened, and the country rubes, simple country folk, and that was generally saying that something strange might have been going on. So I started to investigate it. And more evidence started to stack up, and then such and such a very, very strange thing happened, and it was this was very inexplicable, and at the end I went completely insane." So that's what it generally is like. A Lovecraft story, and this weaves into cosmicism. Essentially, is there will be some sort of eldritch horror, right? So I'm going to use the example of Cthulhu. It's the most well-known, although I might make a point here, if I'm being so bold, that I didn't think it was one of his best by far. I think it was a very middling work. The Call of Cthulhu is the story actually called, where he first bridges the character, or really delves into the entity which is Cthulhu. I didn't really like that one nearly as much as I liked the others, and it was a bit of a build-up that wasn't. It was an anticlimax, because Cthulhu is the one that gets all the hype. If you haven't heard of Lovecraft, you've heard of Cthulhu. You won't have heard of Yog-Sothoth, or what's he called now? The blind idiot god, Azathoth, or the one whose name sounds a bit like a slur, so I won't say it. We'll get into slurs later on, actually. Yes, so you won't have heard of the other old gods, or whatever they are. As I say, I haven't looked into the mythos. But yeah, so Cthulhu is the one and the story, I must say, it was not necessarily one of my favourites. But yeah, so I will use that example. It follows the story of an academic, as previously stated, and there's this very strange series of events that happens to him. Essentially, first there's a bloke who has a dream, and he's a potter, so he creates, or not a potter, yeah, a potter. He creates this pottery reconstruction of this horrible, terrible thing that he's seen in his dream. It's a sort of idol, which is Cthulhu. Little do we know this at the time, of course, and on the base there's all this eldritch script, and so on and so forth. And of course, at first the professor says, pish posh, but then over time, more and more things start happening. More people start having dreams, and essentially what happens is it completely will destroy the main character's beliefs about the world. It'll completely destroy their understandings of everything that they thought they knew, and this will generally drive them to some degree of insanity. And this is essentially the comment. And Lovecraft is not saying, obviously, that Cthulhu exists and he's out there and he's going to kill us. Because, I mean, I personally don't really believe that that is the case. But what he is saying is that man does not have the explanations or the answers for everything in life. Because I think part of what he might have been reacting to is the growing idea and consensus that was present then, certainly, and possibly is still present now. I don't know that it's... I think it's been a bit dulled now, but apparently there's more than likely some people out there who still believe it in a relatively unmodified form, is the belief that science is the key to all things. And while I'm not going to disagree, I do think that science has a lot to offer us, and that it is generally the best way of going forwards. I did have this discussion actually with a friend of mine, so I will try and get into that a bit later. But he's essentially saying that science does not offer all the answers, and he's sort of standing firm against the sort of the dogmatically scientific, if you will, the people who believe that science is less a way of observing the world and more a way of explaining the world, who believe that essentially we've got the answers now and all else be damned, we've got the explanations, we know best. Lovecraft very clearly stands against that kind of belief and would promote a greater degree of sort of skepticism, as it were, which I believe is what science is really meant to be about. But yes, so for example, in his stories, you'll have certain things like non-Euclidean geometry, which are traditionally, not allowed by the laws of science. I don't exactly understand what non-Euclidean geometry is. I don't have an incredible grasp on it, but I think it essentially just means angles and vertices and lengths of things that don't make a lot of sense. So it's impossible angles would be another way of putting it. Is basically shapes that shouldn't happen but do. So he has that, and then he also, I remember, what was it? One of his stories, he has a way that people can tap into the fourth dimension. Again, it's not strictly been disproved by science, because science doesn't really disprove things. I suppose, I don't know, I'm not a scientist. I'd never pretend to be one. I don't want to be one. But I think really, shouldn't science be about explaining things rather than saying things don't exist? That would be my viewpoint anyway. Yes, so that is generally what Lovecraft will do. He will use an example, and I would say rather an extreme example, in the case of eldritch beings with powers to destroy the planet as we know it, that will essentially stand in contradiction to all known and accepted ideas of scientific principle, all the paradigms as they would be put. This does actually link significantly into a bit of my sociology A level, actually, with this whole, is science inherently different to other belief systems like religion, for example? The general consensus among sociologists, or at least a greater number of sociologists whom we learn about, there's a greater number of arguments to say that science is not distinct from religion, although I dare say that probably it's an even split. It's just that there are more differing opinions on the side that it isn't distinct than there are on the it is distinct side, if that made a great deal of sense. I don't know that it did, but it's not important, essentially, so don't worry. In fact, none of this is important. Go and do something worthwhile with your time. Don't sit here and watch me. That being said, yes, Lovecraft would very much have said that we shouldn't be dogmatically committed to science, and that it doesn't necessarily hold all of the answers that we need in life. And I think that's very wise. I think it's very wise to admit one's shortcomings and admit that we don't know everything. Because at the end of the day, what good does it do you to kid yourself about your capabilities? It doesn't do you a great deal of good, I would argue, to believe in things you can't be certain of. Well, now, there is a caveat to that, actually. In that I do like religion. I'm very keen on religion. I don't believe it myself, but there is a great deal of practicality inherent in religion, and that is my caveat there, is essentially, if it does you no good to not believe, or it does you an equal amount of good to believe as to disbelieve, then you may as well believe, hadn't you? So, for example, in terms of the question of God, I've debated this on several occasions with my friend Mr. Ben Knight, rather exhaustingly, actually. It does get rather old. But yes, so what practical benefit does it give you to be an atheist as opposed to being a believer in a religion, any religion? Because when was the last time an atheist built a cathedral? That is my question to you. And I think, and I may be wrong on this, but I really rather like cathedrals, and I would say cathedrals are a net good in terms of culture and making life worth living and justifying man's existence and dominance of the planet. I would say cathedrals are a pretty good thing in terms of all that. Not to mention they look flipping cool. And the same goes for I don't know the Muslim equivalent of a cathedral. I don't know the Jewish equivalent of a cathedral, but I'm sure they're all blooming good. Temple of Solomon, that would probably be something. It's a very ancient example. I don't know if the Temple of Solomon is still the working prototype for all Jewish cathedrals, or the Jewish equivalent of cathedrals. I'm not going to get into religious politics here. I'm not going to do that. That's a place I don't want to go. But yes, so I would argue that religion has a great deal of pragmatic good to do the world, and that even if we can't be certain of it, there's no benefit of skepticism as opposed to belief, in my opinion, on that front. But when it comes to something like science, there is no practical benefit to belief as to disbelief. So, yes, I'd argue that you shouldn't generally believe in things that you can't back up. Remember the caveat, though, of if the alternative is worse or equally as bad, then, you know, why not? But yes, so it's not everything is in our books, I would say. Not everything. Man has not reckoned with all the powers in the universe. I forget who it was now. Was it... it might have been Thomas Edison saying we don't know a tenth of a billionth of anything. And I'd say that's probably pretty on the nose there. Yeah, so we should generally be pretty sceptical about man's knowledge. And I would say Lovecraft is really onto something there. It's a very good, very valid point. Well done, Lovecraft. And it makes his work all the more enjoyable if you know the principle behind it, and would generally side with it. And that may sound a bit shallow, saying that you can only agree with an art form if you agree with the political or psychological or philosophical principle behind it, but I think it would be incorrect and... what is the word now? Incorrect and dishonest to say that it doesn't help if you agree with the message behind the art. I beg your pardon. So I'm just going to go ahead and say it because there's no point lying about that sort of thing. Yes, if you agree with the message behind a piece of art, it does make it more enjoyable. And of course, you can appreciate differing views and you can appreciate the art form that springs from them. As I say, you know, I'm not... other than a vague affection for it, I'm not dedicated in any way to Islam, but I can still appreciate the various, you know, what is it called now? I'm going to seem very ignorant now. Mecca. Mecca's a very beautiful place. I can appreciate that without necessarily agreeing all that stuff about the burning bush, or even without necessarily knowing the stuff about the burning bush. So, you can appreciate differing views, but it does make it a damn sight easier if you appreciate the message behind it. Anyway, that is rather off topic. And speaking of the message behind it, there is some rather contentious field around Lovecraft in that certain people would label him as a racialist or a racist, as is the more popular way of phrasing that particular label nowadays. Because... Now, let's just be very, very frank with this. He was a writer in the 1920s and the 1930s. He is naturally going to have inherited some prejudice of that time, and obviously that doesn't necessarily excuse his actions. Neither does it necessarily condemn him either. There are very seldom entirely, we're in the grey area. There's very seldom pure black and pure white here. It's always very murky, and generally you have to be very careful with things like this. Now... I mentioned earlier that we're going to get back to slurs. Certain people may be aware of what Mr. Lovecraft called his cat. Now, one of my favourite stories from Lovecraft is The Rats in the Walls. which is the first one in this book. It's one of the shorter ones. And that does feature, he's sort of self-inserted his cat into the story. And that does mean that there is prevalent a certain word beginning with an N, which is the name of his cat. Now, obviously, that is not a word that should be used lightly. I wouldn't use that word. But what I would say is that in the specific context of the book, I don't think it's entirely hateful, and it shouldn't rule him out as an author. You shouldn't not read Lovecraft because he writes the N-word. I mean, we're all very familiar with what that N-word is. Or at least I would hope so. If you're not, then parental guidance is necessary there. You know, Peggy 13 or something. That's what it used to say on the Nintendo DS games. Anyway, yes, so we shouldn't disregard Lovecraft just because he has the N-word in his novels, especially since there isn't necessarily any hatred involved in that particular usage of it. It was the name of a cat. I mean, other than it just being an acceptable word to use at that time, or being seen as a more acceptable word to use at the time, is there really any racial hatred inherent in calling a cat that? I don't see so. I mean, I'm obviously biased in having never experienced a kind of racial hatred as is accompanying that word. I thoroughly admit that I may be wrong here, and that I'm not necessarily being as open to other interpretations as I might be. Although, no, I would be open to other interpretations. It's just I haven't come across any because I don't go around debating Lovecraft with people. It's really not worth my time. But what I would say is I don't think it disqualifies him as an author, and I don't think we should ignore his very, very significant contributions to literature just because he chose to call his cat that and then insert his cat into a novel, especially since that plays no relation to the story whatsoever. However, there are certain bits of his other stories that do draw on his particular racial beliefs. He was very entrenched in a belief of about racial hierarchy. So for example, in The Call of Cthulhu, he mentions that the people who are worshipping Cthulhu, the Cthulhu cult, are what he would call the lesser races, what he calls in the book. I mean, this is a term that can be used for dogs, so I'm not going to not say it. He calls them mongrels and half-breeds, essentially. Now, obviously, I wouldn't call a person that, but that is the word he says. I'm not, can we just be very clear about that? This is not me, this is Lovecraft. Essentially, he says that these are the people who will worship Cthulhu, whereas he doesn't have the white men in the story worshipping Cthulhu. He has them basically driven insane. I mean, obviously, it is racialism. It is discrimination based on the premise of race. So that does make it a racialist element of the novella. Is it that bad? I mean, I don't know. I'm not sensitive to this kind of thing, so I genuinely would not know if this is really, really bad on the grand scheme of things. I mean, it doesn't bother me personally, but as I say, I'm not typically sensitive to these kind of matters. I haven't experienced firsthand racial prejudice, so I don't know. I would like to hear possibly whether this is a serious problem, whether Lovecraft is seriously in contravention of what he should have been saying, or what would have been more compassionate to have said. There is nothing a person should say, generally, unless you conform to certain sort of social mores. But what he possibly might have said to be more compassionate and more caring as a human being, which I think we all should be. So yes, I'd be interested in hearing what alternative views on that are. As I said, it doesn't bother me intensely, and I don't think any of it should rule him out as an author. What I would say, though, is that if Lovecraft had lived a bit longer, I mean a hell of a lot longer actually, if he was around today, I think probably he would have altered his views, because we saw he did change his views over time. He was open to changing his views. For example, when he got to know some Irish people, he significantly altered his views about the Irish. He used to think that the Irish were completely incapable of self-governance, that they needed either English or Germans to govern them because they weren't intellectually superior enough. but then he got to know some Irish people and he changed his views. So I think that shows you that this is a man who is not entirely ideologically and prejudiced against people of different nationalities. And I think if he had lived a bit longer, or say if he'd been born a bit later and lived into the present day, then he would not have been as firm a racialist as he possibly was. So I would raise that point. But as I say, I'm not trying to excuse him. What I'm saying is that his work should not be disregarded because of his individual prejudices, and I think we could do a lot better in our society than to do that. Because Lovecraft's really, really, really very good, in my opinion, as I have stated previously, and that doesn't make racialism good. It doesn't make him an advert for racialism, but you have to be able to separate things, and that is essentially what I want to say there. Now, what else was there? I don't know that there was anything else. That might be the entirety of what I wanted to say about Lovecraft. I believe so. Righto. Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you didn't find that too unbearable a chunk of discussion. And perhaps stay tuned for more if you really have nothing else to do with your life. Pip pip, God bless, and take care.